Hey, Dave.
Hey, Trip.
How you doing? So I'm gonna ask you guys some really fun questions. You guys are a good-looking bunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How old are you?
I'm 8. 12.
Pretend that we're old friends. Pretend we're sitting in a room with a bunch of your friends from school, and we're talking. I'm not buying it. What would you say is the hardest thing about being 8?
Recess.
What is the hardest thing about being 4?
Playing with my brother.
What's the hardest thing about being your age right now?
Cooperation and listening.
The hardest thing is it's really hard to choose what I want at a store.
Which one of your fingers tastes the best? Colin, how old is your dad?
1,000.
What do you think your parents were like when they were in high school?
I don't know.
No.
Well, she didn't play with the Barbie dolls because she liked to do her hair, and every time she tried to comb the hair, the doll's head would pop off.
I think they were crazy.
My dad was probably a troublemaker.
Said it in unison.
So if you're in this room and you're watching this and you're a parent, you know a secret. You know a secret that nobody knows unless they're a parent. In fact, it's a secret that some parents who went before you in their parenting journey probably tried to tell you before you were a parent, and you thought you understood, but you didn't really understand it. And here's the secret. Parenting is harder than you think. In fact, that's the number one thing that I find that new parents are surprised about when it comes to parenting, just how hard it really is. I mean, this is a job that has no off hours. In the middle of the night, when your kid wakes up screaming, you're still on. This is a job that requires all of you. In fact, parents are surprised oftentimes that they can no longer go to the restroom alone or eat a meal uninterrupted. Parenting just requires a lot of us. And parenting is hard not just because of how much time it requires of us, but also because our kids kind of trick us. In fact, when you first became a parent, you probably figured out a few things about your new baby. You figured out how to get them to go to sleep or how they like to be held. And then they grew up a little bit and they changed it on you. And then as they were toddlers, maybe you figured out the kind of foods that they like to eat. And so you knew exactly how to cut their sandwich until they grew up a little bit more and they changed it on you. Every kid at every phase is constantly changing. They're changing physically, they're changing mentally, they're changing socially, they're changing emotionally. Kids are just constantly changing. And the rate at which they're changing is often unfamiliar to us as adults because kids' time just moves differently than our time. That's why last week, Reggie talked about time and the importance of valuing what happens every week, because you have 936 weeks from the time your baby is born until the time they grow up and graduate and move on to whatever is next. That's why we spent the past 5 years reading anything and everything we could find on child development, hosting focus groups with leaders who work with kids and teenagers, so we could better understand these changes. Then we summed up some of the basics about these changes in the phase guides. But here's the most important thing for you to remember. If you're a parent of a kindergartner, you will only know your kindergartner once as a kindergartner. And then they'll grow up a little more, and they'll be a first grader. And you'll never know them as a kindergartner again. Now don't let that depress you. It's actually to highlight something very important. And that's this, that every phase has unique potential. In fact, that's how we define a phase. We say this, a phase is a time frame in a kid's life when you can leverage distinctive opportunities to influence their future. There are unique opportunities at every phase. The problem is, as parents, we often don't see what we don't see. Our kids are changing mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, and there are all these things shifting under the surface, and we can just miss it as parents. So here's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna walk through some of the changes that are happening in your kids at each phase, just to help you tune in and pay attention to the unique opportunities that you have. As we go through some of these changes, if you're sitting in the room thinking, well, my kid's not that old yet, use this as an opportunity to think about the future. And if you're sitting in the room and you're thinking, well, my kid has already gone through those phases, you can reflect back into what your time was like with your kids when they were in those phases, because it will give us a different kind of perspective. But here's what you need to remember. Every kid at every phase is asking a question. That question is often the result of the ways that they're changing physically and mentally and culturally, everything that's happening around them. And if you begin to understand the question that your kid is asking at this phase, it will help you know how to respond to your kids this year. Okay, so if you're the parent of a baby or a preschooler, your new baby, your preschooler, is asking an am I question. Imagine with me for just a minute, if you're a new baby, you've arrived in a world where nobody speaks your language, nobody can communicate with you or understand what you're saying. You're not sure when your next meal will show up or if anybody's gonna help you get back to sleep when you're tired. The question a baby is asking is, am I safe? And your job as a parent is to prove to them in this first year of life, in this critical window, yes, they are safe. As they grow up just a little bit more in the preschool years, that question begins to shift to, am I able? And if you have a 1-year-old or 2-year-old, you've probably begun to understand this question because you have a child that's telling you, I can do it myself. I can buckle my own seatbelt. I can put on my own clothes. I can pick out my own outfit. Then they grow up a little bit more, and the discipline years come into play. And you begin to let them know that what they just did might not have been the best choice. And kids begin to ask the question, am I really good? Am I really okay? Then your kid grows up and they go to elementary school. The questions are no longer am I questions, they begin to be do I have questions. When you walk into a kindergarten classroom anywhere, you understand the question that a kindergartner is asking. And it's this, do I have your attention? Because when you walk in the room, every kindergartner will automatically come forward to begin to tell you their story. And if you don't pay attention to them, they just get a little bit closer to you and a little bit louder and a little closer and a little louder because they all want to know they have your attention. Then there's something that changes in the brain of a second grader and a third grader. They begin to compare themselves to others in a different way. And the question becomes, do I have what it takes? Do I have what it takes to get my work on the bulletin board? Do I have what it takes to make the team or to get in the club? And then they grow up a little bit more. And if you have a 4th grader or a 5th grader, your kid begins to ask, do I have friends? Friends begin to matter at a whole new level. If you have a 4th grader or a 5th grader, they're looking to their friends to understand how their peers see them in a new light. And then something unique happens as your kid begins the middle school phases of life. And the questions shift from a black and white question where you're trying to answer them with the answer yes, into a question that's a little bit more gray, it's a little bit more personal. Your 6th grader begins to ask this question, who do I like? Which really, let's be honest, is kind of another way of just saying, who likes me? Because if you travel around with 6th graders very often, you begin to see that none of them go anywhere alone, that they like to be affirmed by a lot of other middle schoolers around them. In the 7th grade, the question gets even more personal and it becomes, who am I? As they discover the answer to who they are and as they begin that journey, they're looking to their friends and their peers to understand how other people are viewing them and how they are seen in their peer group. As your middle schooler begins to be an 8th grader, they start looking into the future in a new way, and they start anticipating and taking a little bit more ownership than maybe they did as a 7th grader. And the question shifts again to be, who do I want to be? Then they move into 9th grade. You're in the last 4 years. As a 9th grader begins high school, the number one question that 9th graders are asking is, where do I belong? There are so many activities, so many peer groups, so many places where they could find belonging. And the number one question they really want to resolve that year is, where will I belong? Where will I find acceptance? In 10th grade, Maybe they get a driver's license. Maybe they have a little bit more freedom. They begin to kind of push against your rules in a different kind of way. And their question really is, why should I believe? Which is another way of just asking you, why should I believe you about anything? Why should I believe you that the thing that you said that was so bad is really that bad because I know somebody who tried it and it seemed like it went okay? They want to know why they should believe. In the 11th grade, an 11th grader wants to know, how can I matter right now, right where I am? Not one day in the future, but how can I matter today? And then in their senior year, seniors begin to ask the question deep inside, what will I do next? What will I do when I graduate, when I move on to the next thing in my life? When you begin to understand the questions that your kids are asking at every phase, you begin to look at your parenting role in a new light. You begin to understand that over time, as your kid is asking a different question, the way that you respond in your parenting style has to shift as well. That's why we've identified one role for each life stage as you respond to the questions your kids are asking. So if you remember nothing else this week, I want you to try to remember your one word, your one role that I'm about to give you, because it will become the guidepost for how you parent in the next year ahead. So if you have a preschooler, if you're in the phases of life where your child has just entered the world and they're asking the foundational am I questions, your role in this phase of life is to embrace their physical needs. Embrace their physical needs by consistently showing up over time to let them know that they're safe, to let them know that they're able, to let them understand that they really are okay. If you're a parent in the elementary years, you're in kind of the sweet years of childhood. Your kid is old enough to do some things on their own now that they haven't done before, and yet you're not quite to the middle school years where maybe the emotions and the hormones are ramping up in a new kind of way. In these years of elementary school, your role is to engage their interests. And I'm gonna give you a little secret. Every elementary school kid is interested in the same thing. They're interested in themselves. If you want to engage the interests of your elementary school kid, you need to be fascinated with who they are. Pay attention to them, listen to their stories, maybe look back across their earlier childhood years and tell them a little bit more about how you saw them as they were growing up. Then in the middle school years, your role is simply to affirm their personal journey. We say to affirm a middle schooler simply for this one reason, because we've never seen a middle schooler who was overly affirmed. Every middle schooler craves affirmation, especially from you, their parent. So affirm your middle schooler, affirm their personal journey so that they know that you are there and that you are surrounding them and supporting them, even in these years where there is so much change taking place. And then if you have a high schooler, your one role is to mobilize their potential. These are the years where there's a lot of holding on and letting go, and sometimes it won't feel comfortable and sometimes you won't know which one you're supposed to do in the moment. But your ultimate goal is to mobilize their potential for whatever is next. So last week we talked about how you have a limited number of weeks. We challenged you to get maybe a marble jar or some other system so that you could begin to identify the number of weeks you have left with your kid. This week, we want you to pay attention to what is changing, how this phase is unique and different from maybe the phases that have come before or the phases that may come later, so that you can understand that you have a unique opportunity with your kid right now. So, pause. Pay attention to what's changing in your kids in this phase and begin to ask yourself, what can I do to rediscover them now?